it's time for next presenter, Mr. William Altman from Brazil, and his title of a presentation will be "To which branch of eİdωλοποιική do the Eleatic strangers own eİkόνες belong?" So let's welcome Mr. William Altman, and it's your turn.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organizers of this conference. As you can see from Christina's presentation, and I've had the chance to read her 2020 paper, this session was put together with great intelligence, and Hyekyong and the other organizers of the conference deserve a lot of praise throughout. It's a real honor to be here. Just by way of introduction, I'm a retired public high school history and civics teacher. I'm very pleased that the United States of America has just passed its most difficult civics lesson by getting rid of the tyrant in waiting with the election of Joseph Biden. I have just finished the 5th and final volume of my study of the reading order of Plato's dialogues, I'm happy to say, and I thought I would find nothing else that would amuse me as much as writing about those dialogues, but I'm hard at work on a project now that's got me tracking down Demosthenes and having a good deal of fun. So it's a great pleasure to be here. By the way, if any of you want my paper to see it, I just uploaded it to academia.edu if you want to read along. Okay, so to which branch of εἰδωλοποιική do the Eleatic strangers own εἰκόνες belong? This brief paper is part of a broader project that aims to show why the Eleatic stranger is neither Plato's philosopher nor the mouthpiece for Plato's later or post-Socratic views. That project takes as philosophically significant the fact that Theaetetus, sophist and statesman, stand in close connection with Euthyphro and Apology of Socrates, and thus that when the placement of Euthyphro between Theaetetus and sophist is given its due, indisputable on dramatic grounds, then Apology of Socrates directly follows sophist and statesman, a position indicating that Socrates, not the Eleatic stranger, is and remains Plato's philosopher, with Apology occupying the place of the ostentatiously missing philosopher. The broader question of which the Eleatic stranger is not, therefore depends on a fraught and controversial decision to regard Plato's dramatic indications as being of greater significance than the modern interpretive paradigm, based on order of composition, is willing to accord them. An interpretive method that separates and indeed divorces Euthyphro and Apology as early from Theaetetus, sophist, and statesman as compositionally late dialogues. The present paper bows to the hegemony of this divorce by considering sophist only in the context of the its equally late twin statesman, a dialogue that refers to it by name. In support of a broader claim about what the Eleatic stranger is not, a consideration of the images he uses in Statesman indicates, on the basis of how the class of image making or εἰδωλοποιική is divided in Sophist, what it is that Plato's Eleatic stranger really is. Quite apart from the claim that Apology of Socrates is Plato's philosopher, there are three general points that deserve prior consideration. 1, the Eleatic stranger is at considerable pains to make himself appear to be the philosopher, suggesting, without stating, that the reason philosopher is missing is because his method has already shown who the philosopher is, i.e. himself. 2, he is likewise at considerable pains to demonstrate, both before the great digression and after it, the sense in which Socrates is a sophist, albeit one of noble lineage. And 3, he has been largely successful in making himself appear to be what the absence of philosopher precludes him from simply being. In other words, he has managed to persuade a majority of Plato scholars that he is the philosopher Plato never allows him to describe, much less simply and expressly to be. The alleged embodiment of Plato's missing philosopher in the stranger himself is therefore an easily recognizable example of the being of non-being. He invites us to take him to be what he is not, for the proof that he is what he wants us to take him to be is missing. There is actually no such thing as the philosopher in Plato's Statesman, and only if the image in question is a phantasma is it accurate to speak of the image of the philosopher in the prologue of Plato's Sophist. Here, I will concentrate only on the images the stranger uses, an artificial restriction, since the true master of fantastike reveals himself at the end of Sophist not through the tools he uses, but because he is himself the organon of creating the phantasma. That's Sophist 267a. The division of εἰδωλοποιική between fantastike and eikastike is of critical importance to the structure of Sophist as a whole, flanking as it does the great digression of the being of non-being. Although curiously left unstated before the digression, it is fantastike that will emerge unmistakably as the Sophist's province after it. In other words, we need to recall the pre-digression division of εἰδωλοποιική after having traversed the digression, in much the same way that we will likewise need to recall that division in Sophist when considering the images the stranger uses in Statesman. What will ultimately emerge as being the Sophist's branch of εἰδωλοποιική does not preserve the actual dimensions of the thing that it imitates. The kind of imitation that does so, the stranger calls eikastike. Instead, the Sophist imitates in a manner that only persuades the ignorant from afar. It imitates great things by imitating merely the appearance of those things, quote, when looked at, close quote, in Christina's memorable phrase, quote, from a non-beautiful, superficial, and as such ignorant point of view, close quote, and not the things themselves. The fact that the stranger has made so many think that he has already conveyed the substance of the philosopher without providing a discourse called philosopher, therefore suggests from the start his mastery of what he calls fantastike. But the devil is in the details. Consider first the two meanings of paradigma in Sophist Statesman. When the stranger distinguishes the two branches of εἰδωλοποιική before the digression in Sophist, paradigma designates the original to be imaged. In Statesman, the paradigma of the weaver is the image, while the statesman is the original. As such, the paradigma of the weaver joins the two εἰκόνες used and identified as such in Statesman, the doctor and the steersman. It is with the triad of doctor, steersman, and weaver that my talk is principally concerned, because the stranger's use of these εἰκόνες in Statesman is the principal basis on which a determination can be made as to which branch of εἰδωλοποιική, as distinguished by him in Sophist, the Eleatic stranger's own εἰκόνες belong. As already indicated, sophistic has been linked to fantastike by the end of Sophist, and this gives the question I am raising its bite. If the εἰκόνες the stranger uses in Statesman belong to the branch of εἰδωλοποιική made constitutive of sophistic in Sophist, then he is himself the Sophist he has been hunting. The division between eikastike and fantastike at Sophist 235d6 to 236d8 is itself based on an image, that of a sculptor. If the sculpted image of a giant hero preserved the actual dimensions of the paradigma, its head would appear smaller than it should be. Hence, deceptive modifications are required in order to preserve the appearance of the original. The key word here is the stranger's use of to deon. Quote, If they reproduce the true proportions of their beautiful subjects, you see, the upper parts would appear smaller than they should, smikrotera tu deontos, and the lower parts would appear larger, because we see the upper parts from farther away and the lower parts from closer. Noburo Notomi, building on Seth Bernadetti, discovered the primordial incongruity here. The image of the sculpture depends on a large statue seen from afar, and thus the stranger's image of image making presupposes the audience's prior familiarity with the appearance of the original, emphasizing that now they are seeing from afar what they have already seen nearby. But as Notomi writes, quote, in the case of the sophist's argument, however, the audience, also the young, stand far removed, though in the metaphorical sense, not from the image, but from the reality which is imitated, because they do not yet have the necessary knowledge of reality. The spoken image, on the other hand, is immediately presented before them, close quote. Highlighting the importance of the image of the sculptor in Sophist is the stranger's confession in Statesman that he has been led into error by acting like a rushing sculptor in comparing the statesman to a shepherd. Quote, visitor speaking, just as sculptors sometimes hurry when it is not appropriate to do so, para kairon, and actually lose time by making additions and increasing the size of various parts of their work beyond what is necessary, pleo kai mezzo tu deontos, so too in our case. I suppose that in order to give a grand as well as a quick demonstration of the mistake in the route we previously took, we thought it was appropriate, prepen, to the king to give large-scale illustrations, megala paradigmata, close quote. By comparing himself to a rushing sculptor and statesman, this time making things greater than todeon, whereas in Sophist, eikostike was responsible for making the hero's head smaller than todeon. The stranger provides the reader with an important indication of Plato's intentions, unmistakable if we are willing to cast off the stranger's doxa-based spell that he is Plato's philosopher. With respect to statesmen, we are more obviously being prepared to ask ourselves what todeon will mean when it, along with hokairos and toprepon, reappears as a synonym for tometrion. But we are also being prepared to see the stranger as a practitioner of fantastike. And when he refers to his lesser paradigmata as eikones, that's it, Statesman 297, E8. We may well remember that the stranger has already compared himself to a sculptor who makes things mezza tu deontos, an echo of his earlier description of fantastike in Sophist. But it is not the meta-image of the sculptor or the final paradigm of the weaver that best illustrates why the division of εἰδωλοποιική into fantastike and eikostike is central to Plato's intention to unmask his stranger for his chosen readers, loyal admirers of Socrates, along with those whom the stranger will ridicule as late learners and friends of the forms. By expressly denominating the doctor and the steersman as eikones, the stranger clearly indicates that he expects us to regard them as products of eikostike, as opposed to fantastike. But Plato does not permit him to offer any defense of this view. The question then becomes one of symmetry, wherein the reader of Statesman must recall both the pre-digression division of εἰδωλοποιική and Sophist as well as the unmistakable link established after the digression between sophistic and fantastique. In order to see that the stranger's images are equally asymmetric, the single most important step is to see what they have in common. The eikones of the doctor and the steersman both make the killing of human beings commensurate with life-saving measures. It is a science-based license to kill that asymmetrically connects the doctor's amputation of a diseased limb for the good of the patient, that's Statesman 293A9 to E2, CF 298A2 to B2, and the steersman's order to throw unnecessary baggage overboard for the safety of the crew. That's Politicus 296E4 to 297A5, CF 298B3 to 6. The same asymmetry reappears when the elimination of undesirable human beings is made commensurate with discarding unsatisfactory threads before the weaving process begins. That's at Politicus 308C1 to 309A4, a process that will eventually restore the stranger's statesman to the pre-myth status of a flock-breeding shepherd, thus justifying through a widening gyre the apparent error of the rushing sculptor. It is therefore on the basis of his use of this inhumane asymmetry, all in defense of a murderous techne, that Plato challenges the reader to recognize that fantastique, not eikastike, is the branch of eidolopoike, to which the Eleatic stranger's own eikones belongs. It is in Statesman that Plato has caused the Eleatic stranger to reveal himself as the sophist he is hunted in Sophist, all the way up to Socrates' doorstep. And it is no accident that Plato has allowed him to do so on the eve of an Athenian jury's decision to murder Socrates, allegedly for the good of the city.
Thank you for your inspirational presentation, Mr. William Altman. It's time. It's time for discussion. So anybody to have some comment or question to Mr. William Altman? Yes, Christina.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's quite interesting that, you know, I was arguing that the Eleatic stranger is a philosopher, not necessarily that he is the mouthpiece of Plato himself, but that he is a philosopher that Plato is sympathetic to. And William was arguing that not at all, the Eleatic stranger is definitely a sophist. And so I think that this is like a great point to begin our discussion from. So what specifically, William, would you say that character like makes the Eleatic stranger be a sophist? Like what makes you so convinced that he is a sophist even while he's introducing this dialectical method and even while we have Socrates in the background listening to him, he's not trying to interrupt him. So it seems like he's leading the show here and Plato lets him lead the show. And so I'm just wondering what would be kind of the ammunition that you have to make him into such a grand sophist.
Well, you know, thank you so much for the question, Christina, and I'm sure the audience won't be surprised to hear that Christina and I had some very lively discussions before we gave our presentation after she was kind enough to share with me her 2020 paper. And as you can see, you know, she's making the distinction between eikastike and fantastike, but as she says, in a way that's more sympathetic to the stranger than I am. I'm a great fan, Christina, of David Corey's book on the sophists in Plato's dialogues. And at a stage when Laxenmost and his followers are busy trying to enroll Socrates in the ranks of the sophists, placing him next to Protagoras and Gorgias, I think it's, it's time to point out the obvious, which is that Plato certainly doesn't see things that way. And that Plato clearly thinks that the reader's ability to distinguish a sophist from a philosopher is crucial to whatever it is that Plato is trying to teach us. And this is obvious in hundreds of ways, by naming the Protagoras after Protagoras, by having Protagoras be a leading character in the Theaetetus, by having Hippias preside over a couple of dialogues. In other words, by having Thrasymachus do his thing in Book 1 of the Republic. I mean, Plato is clearly willing to give the sophists their say, but never, as you say, I think, and it's accurately stated, that never does he give, on my account, a sophist as great an opportunity to sell his wares in so deceptive a manner as he gives the Eleatic stranger. And I think what I would say, Christine, is that in a way it all depends on the Theaetetus. It all depends on the great digression in the Theaetetus, it seems to me. Because you remember that the philosopher that Socrates describes in the great digression is somebody that's absolutely indifferent to his interlocutors. They're all interchangeable to him. He presides above, he looks down upon the affairs of men from a lofty ethereal height. And leading to the passage that so entranced the Neoplatonists is that he actually recommends the homoiosis theo. And so that if the philosopher of the Theaetetus digression is Plato's philosopher, well, then the Eleatic stranger looks a little bit more like that kind of a philosopher. What I would say, of course, is that, to me, it's the key passage in the Theaetetus is where Socrates first sees young Theaetetus and says, I can't remember the young lad's name, but he's from Sunium. I seem to remember his father's name. I remember how much money he had. Like, in other words, for Socrates, he's not indifferent as to whether they're from Athens or from somebody else. He's not indifferent who they are. They're not interchangeable parts for him. And I don't believe that Socrates is interested in the homoiosis theo. I think he's interested in anthropine sophia, a human wisdom, which seems humble and of no account compared to all of the myriad subjects that the Eleatic stranger can discourse on with such eloquence, beginning with the angler and ending with the weaver. A true know-it-all, if you know what I mean. And so I think my answer to your question is just that it's clearly Plato's intent to challenge us to separate a philosopher from a sophist, and he could not have done a better job than by allowing a sophist to appear as something other than one. I just have to, that there's a rumor that went around that Xenophon wrote his Cyropedia after reading almost the first two books of Plato's Republic. And I've come to believe that. And I think that what Xenophon realized is that what Plato had not supplied, he had supplied a just man who appears to be unjust, but he had not supplied an unjust man that appears to be perfectly just. And that's the way I solved the great riddle of Xenophon's Cyropedia. In other words, a guy that looks totally Socratic, a battle-winning, excellent horse-riding, kind of speechifying, sweating, eating to no excess, kind of semi-Socratic, and yet a tyrant, who appears to all the world to be a just man, but who is not. And I think that Plato was inspired by that to create not only the Eleatic, but more importantly, the Athenian strangers, who have managed to fool people, as I believe was Plato's intent, that they should, to fool a large number of people into thinking that they were his spokesman, and yet they're not. He remains a Socratic. Thank you for your question.
Yes, Mr. Professor Notomi? Yes, it's
thank you, William. I like your suggestion that it is readers, us, who are responsible of the distinction between the philosopher and the sophist. I like it. But in that case, we should doubt the Socrates as a philosopher, don't we? That is the question. Yes, because it's and Plato. Finally, I believe he proves to be that Socrates is a real philosopher. I believe it, but still he need to have question about Socrates. So your argument is a bit bit on one side. Socrates was a philosopher, but the Eleatic philosopher, a sophist. I think we should examine both whether they are sophist or philosopher. That's my question.
Well, Professor.
Sorry. One additional question. Particularly the middle part of the sophist. How do you see the middle part of the dialectical discussion of the Megistagene and others? I think that's a more philosophical exercise than sophistic one. Yeah.
Okay, well, many of us here know Professor Notomi, and just briefly, I will tell you that when I first wrote to Professor Notomi and expressed an interest in his book, which I didn't own being stuck here in Brazil, he sent me a beautiful copy of it, which I read with great pleasure, and it's a real delight to be interrogated by Nobi, especially on this question. And of course, Noboru is recently kind of moved in what I consider a very unfortunate direction in the International Socrates Society paper, in the direction precisely of saying, let's look at Socrates in context and find the sophistic elements. And I think this is beautiful. It really is, it's a conflict. Is Socrates the sophist, or is the Eleatic stranger the sophist? Now, I feel like my position, the best Noboru can do is say that Plato has distorted things. In other words, Plato came, and this is the same move that Livio Rossetti and many others. Okay, so good. Let's grant you your point. Plato is responsible. That makes my argument stronger that Socrates is Plato's philosopher and that the Eleatic stranger is Plato's sophist. So now I agree that he's not lax and most's philosopher. And I hope, and I'm still hoping that you'll recover. I was very pleased to see that you were much more critical of Lax and Most in your paper than you were in that abstract, which really pleased me. I think you're, the question that you ask about the digression, first of all, I hope the whole audience realizes what's ironic about Noboru asking that question, because his brilliant book on the sophist was precisely sidestepping the great digression and showing and calling attention to the parts that are so important on either side of the digression. And in a really gutsy move executed at Cambridge, he kind of broke with a tradition of Michael Freda and G.L. Owen and many other people to very boldly look at the dialogue as a whole, for which he must be commended. What I would say, in a word, is that I believe that although I believe that Plato is a Socratic, I believe that he's also a Parmenidean. And I believe that the critical moment takes place at around 240 AD, 249 in the Great Digression, where he argues that being is not a kineton. And of course, as you know, Parmenides insists twice that being is a kineton. And this is where my argument that we have to read the sophist in harmony with the Euthyphro, it comes into being, because obviously the Euthyphro is a very simple dialogue. It can be used to introduce, Thrasymachus used it to introduce all the dialogues. But there are two features of the Euthyphro, it seems to me, that are extremely important in the context of the Great Digression. The one is the very juvenile lesson in active and passive voices, which of course is crucial for the Eleatic stranger's argument that by being known, being is changed, which is one of the lamest arguments in Plato. Like, in other words, if I'm seeing Noboru, then Noboru is changed by being seen by me, is just ridiculous. That's, as Geach called it, Cambridge change, i.e. no change at all. But the other thing, of course, is that the whole dramatic setting of the Euthyphro is about parricide. It's about Euthyphro bringing a charge against his father and being prepared to put his father to death. And my argument is that the Eleatic stranger demonstrates himself in the, and maybe it's worse than being a sophist. What he demonstrates himself to be in the Great Digression is a parricide. He demonstrates himself to be a parricide because because for all the inclusion of change and rest in the megistagene that you guys are so in love with, look, I'm a Platonist. I like the idea of the good, the idea of beauty, and the idea of justice. I'll stick with those as my megistagene. Thank you very much. But if we have to talk about change and rest, then it seems to me that the number, the shameless number that the Eleatic stranger performs on whether being can be changed marks him as something worse than a sophist, a Parmenidean parricide.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting discussion and live discussion.